In polite society, a duke may survive scandal, but he is never meant to survive love. They told him she died of fever. They told him she was buried quietly. They told him to mourn and move on. So he did. For 7 years. Until the day he met a boy with his eyes, and a girl who looked at him the way her mother once had. And the dead do not raise twins. 7 years earlier, she had been nothing more than a maid in his father's estate, quiet, intelligent, careful with her laughter. He had been young, idealistic, reckless enough to believe that love could outrun lineage. The night before he was sent abroad, he promised her something no duke should promise a servant. "When I return, I will marry you." By morning, he was gone. Months later, he received the letter. She had fallen ill. She had died. And somewhere far from the estate that once held her footsteps, she was giving birth to his children. Unseen. Unacknowledged. Very much alive. Before we begin, tell me something. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Is it late at night, and you should be asleep? Are you listening on your way to work? Or are you under a blanket somewhere, escaping the world for a little while? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I will read every single one. And if you believe love deserves the truth, even after 7 years of lies, leave a heart in the comments. Let's begin. There are love stories that turn records with great ceremony. This is not one of them. The Camberhall estate had a particular way of reminding those who served it of their place. It was not cruel about this. It simply was, in the height of the ceilings, the weight of the silver, the way sound itself seemed to defer to the family who owned it. Servants learned quickly to move through its corridors like breath, present, necessary, and entirely unremarked upon. Ada Ambrose had been on staff for 11 months when the young Duke first noticed her. Not because she was careless. Not because she spoke out of turn or reached beyond her station in any way that could be named and corrected. She was, by every observable measure, exactly what a housemaid ought to be, efficient, quiet, precise. But she did not lower her eyes in fear. In respect, yes. There was a difference, and Harrison Camberhall, 21 and freshly burdened with the minor responsibilities his father had begun to delegate, noticed it immediately. Most of the staff looked away when he entered a room. Ada looked down, briefly, appropriately, and then returned to whatever she had been doing with the same unhurried focus she had carried before he arrived. As though his presence was worthy of acknowledgement, but not of disruption. He found this, unreasonably, fascinating. "The library is where I first observed them speak." She had been reshelving. He had come looking for a particular volume on land surveying, a task his father had assigned him with the quiet expectation that he would find it tedious and grow into it regardless. He had not expected company. Neither had she. "You've placed Blackstone in the wrong section," he said, not unkindly. She paused. Looked at the spine. Looked at him. "With respect, Your Grace, Blackstone belongs with legal theory. You'll find land management 2 shelves to your left." A beat of silence. He moved to the correct shelf. Found his volume. And instead of leaving, as any reasonable young duke with no ulterior motive would have done, he lingered. "You read?" he asked. "I shelve," she said. Then, after a careful pause, "But yes." Her name, I should note, was Ada. And from the way she held herself in that moment, spine straight, neither eager nor hostile, simply present, it was already clear that whatever happened next would not be simple. He asked her name before he left. She gave it without performance. He came back the following afternoon, ostensibly for a different volume. She was there again. This time, he did not pretend the book was the reason. "What are you reading?" he asked. "What I'm permitted," she said. "And what you're not." The faintest pause. Lock, when the shelf is within reach and the household is otherwise occupied. He laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. "I will not tell you they fell in love that afternoon. Love, when it is real and inconvenient, does not arrive all at once. It arrives the way winter does, in small, almost imperceptible degrees, until one morning you look up and everything has changed, and you cannot name the precise moment it happened. What I will tell you is this. He returned every day that week. And she, who was intelligent enough to know better, allowed herself to look forward to it. The estate, for its part, kept its silence. It had seen this before. It knew, as estates do, how such things tend to end. Some things are not spoken of in polite society. The slow unraveling of good sense, for instance. Or the precise moment a young duke stops pretending he has come for the books. It began, as most dangerous things do, with small allowances. A conversation extended by 5 minutes. Then 10. Then long enough that the afternoon light shifted across the library floor and neither of them remarked upon it. Harrison told himself it was the novelty. He had spent 21 years surrounded by people who agreed with him, tutors who praised his conclusions, guests who deferred to his opinions, a father who corrected him only in private, where it could not undermine authority. Ada Ambrose did none of these things. She simply responded. Sometimes in agreement. Sometimes not. He found the latter almost unreasonably satisfying. She, for her part, was careful. Ada understood what he perhaps did not yet, that warmth from a duke was not the same as safety. That attention, however genuine in the moment, was a currency that changed value depending on who was spending it and what they stood to lose. She had seen enough of the estate's quiet machinery to know how these things worked. She liked him anyway. That was the trouble. It was raining the afternoon, everything shifted slightly on its axis. She had been crossing the east garden with an armful of linens when the sky made its decision. She moved quickly toward the nearest shelter, a stone alcove along the garden wall, half covered in ivy, and found, upon arriving, that she was not the first to think of it. Harrison was already there. Neither of them had planned it. I was watching, and I can confirm, neither of them had planned it. They stood at opposite edges of the alcove, listening to the rain rearrange itself against the stone, and said very little. He offered to send for an umbrella. She said it wasn't necessary. He said the storm would pass quickly. She agreed that it usually did. Then she said, without looking at him, "You grew up watching this garden." "I did." "It must be strange. Owning something you loved before you understood ownership." He was quiet for a moment. "I've never thought of it that way." "Most people don't," she said. Not unkindly. The rain continued. He did not send for the umbrella. She did not leave. By the third week, I observed something I had not expected from a young man of his particular upbringing. Patience. He did not press. Did not maneuver her into corners, conversational or otherwise. He simply appeared, asked nothing unreasonable, and listened with the specific attention of someone who has discovered, perhaps for the first time, that another person's thoughts are genuinely worth following. It was, I confess, rather affecting to witness. She began to lower her guard. Incrementally. The way someone opens a window in uncertain weather, just enough to test what comes through. One afternoon he reached across the reading table to pass her a volume she'd been searching for, and his hand brushed hers in the exchange. Neither pulled away immediately. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. The kind of 2 seconds that arranged themselves, quietly and without permission, into memory. She looked up. He was already looking at her. "You are not beneath me," he said. Quietly. With the particular seriousness of someone who has considered the words before speaking them. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "You say that as though it costs you nothing." She gathered the linens she'd set aside and left before he could answer. She was not wrong to walk away. I want to be clear about that. She simply also could not stop thinking about what he'd said. Neither could he. There is a particular kind of father who does not raise his voice. Who does not need to. The Camberhall patriarch was such a man. I watched him watch them for 2 weeks before he acted. Patience, it seemed, ran in the family. The Duke's father noticed patterns. This was, in many ways, his greatest gift and his most dangerous quality. Edward Camberhall had built and preserved a dukedom not through force but through observation, through the careful cataloguing of what people wanted, what they feared, and precisely how much distance existed between the two. He had noticed the library visits by the second week. He had said nothing. By the third week, he had noted the garden. The extended exchanges. The way his son's posture changed, almost imperceptibly, when a particular housemaid entered a room he occupied. He had still said nothing. Edward Camberhall was not a man who moved before he understood the full shape of a problem. By the fourth week, he understood it entirely. He summoned Harrison after dinner. Not urgently. That was deliberate. An urgent summons suggested alarm, and alarm suggested that whatever had prompted it held power. Edward did not grant power to things he intended to dismantle. Harrison arrived composed, which meant he suspected nothing. Good. The study was lit warmly. His father stood at the window with a glass of port, looking out at the grounds with the expression of a man contemplating nothing in particular. "You've been spending time in the library," his father said. "I have." Harrison settled into the chair across the desk. "The surveying documents you assigned require." "With the Ambrose girl." A pause. Small, but present. "We've spoken, yes." His father turned from the window. Not sharply. Everything Edward Camberhall did, he did with the unhurried weight of someone who had never once been required to rush. "You forget what you are," he said. It was not a question. It was not quite an accusation. It landed somewhere in between, the way his father's words often did. Precise enough to wound, measured enough to deny. Harrison met his eyes. "I forget nothing. I simply—" "You simplify," his father said, returning to his desk. "That is the indulgence of youth. You look at a situation and remove its complications because the complications are inconvenient to what you want." He Saturday folded his hands. "She is a housemaid, Harrison. Whatever she is beyond that, however clever, however composed, she is employed by this estate. And you are its future. These two facts do not negotiate with each other." Harrison said nothing immediately. "I have found, in my observations, that the most significant responses are not the ones spoken first." "She has done nothing improper," he said finally. Evenly. "No," his father agreed. "She hasn't." "I did not say she had." A pause. "I am saying that you are approaching something that cannot be undone quietly. And quiet is the only way things of this nature should ever end." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the grounds were dark. "I will be more discreet," Harrison said. His father looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said simply. "You will." He did not forbid it outright. That, I understood later, was the strategy. An outright prohibition would have galvanized a young man of Harrison's temperament. Idealists require opposition to harden their resolve. Edward knew this. Instead, he planted something quieter. Doubt. Responsibility. The gentle, suffocating weight of what you are. He began making inquiries the following morning. Harrison returned to his rooms that night and told himself the conversation had resolved nothing. He was correct. His father had not intended it to. "I have recorded many farewells in my time observing this particular corner of society. Most are performed. This one was not. That is precisely what made it difficult to witness." The announcement came at breakfast. Diplomatic training. The Earl of Westhaven's office in Edinburgh, an opportunity, his father said, that had been arranged with considerable effort and should not be squandered. 3 months, perhaps 4. Harrison would leave Friday. It was Tuesday. Harrison received this information with the stillness of someone who recognized, in the same moment of hearing it, that it had not been arranged for his benefit. He said nothing at breakfast. He found Ada in the linen corridor before noon. "You know," she said, before he could speak. She was folding. Her hands did not stop moving. This, I noted, was deliberate, something to do with them. "Friday," he confirmed. "A beat." Edinburgh is not so far. Ada. She looked up then. And whatever she had been preparing to say, the practical thing, the sensible thing, the thing that acknowledged distance without assigning it meaning, she did not say it. He looked like a man who had just understood that something was being taken from him, and had not yet decided what to do about it. "Walk with me," he said. "I shouldn't." "I know." She set the linen down. The grounds at dusk had a particular quality, the light neither gold nor grey, the air holding the last of the day's warmth without committing to it. They walked the long path toward the eastern wall, the one obscured from the main house by the old yew hedge. He did not reach for her hand immediately. They walked in silence first, the way people do when the thing that needs saying is large enough to require approach. "He arranged this," Harrison said. "Yes." "You're not surprised?" "I'm a housemaid in a duke's estate," she said quietly. "I am never surprised when power arranges itself against inconvenience." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before stopping as well, and when she turned to face him the last of the light caught the careful composure she was maintaining and the effort behind it. "You are not an inconvenience," he said. "Harrison." His name, in her voice, without his title, she had never done that before. It landed between them with the weight of everything unsaid. "Don't make promises the morning hasn't earned yet." "Then let me make them now." He closed the distance between them. Not urgently. With the same deliberate patience that had defined every moment between them, as though she was something worth approaching correctly. "When I return, I will marry you." The silence that followed was not empty. She looked at him for a long moment. Searching. For doubt, I think. For the performance of sincerity that dissolves when witnessed clearly enough. She found neither. "You say that," she said, "as though your father will simply." "I don't care what my father will simply." Quiet. Certain. "I care what I will." Her composure held. But her eyes, just briefly, did not. "I'm frightened," she admitted. Barely above a whisper. The most she had ever given him. "So am I," he said. And then, because it was the last evening, and because some things do not survive being left unsaid, she let him hold her. His arms around her, careful, present, unhurried, and her face against his shoulder, and the yew hedge standing its silent guard, and the estate in the distance burning its evening lights. They stayed like that long enough that the light finished dying. What came after, I will record only this: it was tender. It asked nothing reckless. It held, in the way that moments hold when both people understand it may be all they are given. By morning, he was gone. She stood at the servants' entrance and watched the carriage until the road took it. She did not cry. Not yet. She was still holding the shape of his promise like something fragile she hadn't found a place for. Letters are curious things. They arrive carrying one person's truth and deliver it into another's hands, where it becomes something else entirely. I have seen letters save people. I have seen them used as weapons. These were both. Edinburgh was grey and purposeful, and Harrison worked. He attended meetings he did not request, read documents he did not find interesting, and performed the function of a young duke acquiring diplomatic competence with sufficient diligence that no one could fault him. He was, by every external measure, exactly where his father had intended him to be. Internally, he was elsewhere entirely. Her letters arrived every 2 weeks. Precise intervals, she would not write so frequently as to appear desperate, nor so sparingly as to suggest indifference. This, I recognized, was Ada, calibrating even her longing. He read them more than once. More than twice. In the particular privacy of early morning, before the day's obligations could demand his full attention. She wrote about small things. The way the East Garden looked after the October frost settled. A passage in Locke she had returned to and found differently weighted than before. The particular silence of the estate after the household retired, which she had begun to find either peaceful or unbearable depending on the evening, and she had not yet determined what made the difference. She did not write "I miss you." She wrote things that meant it instead. He understood every word. His replies were less restrained. You describe the frost, and I find myself unreasonably envious of a garden. Return soon. You said nothing about that. I am counting Edinburgh's grey skies and finding I prefer the view from the library window, which I recognize is not about the view at all. She kept these letters. I know this because of what came later. In a small wooden box, beneath a change of clothes, in a room she was eventually asked to vacate. She kept every one. The correspondence continued through October, into November. Then his letters stopped arriving. She waited 2 weeks, which was reasonable. Then 3, which was less so. She wrote once more, carefully, without accusation, leaving space for any number of explanations involving diplomatic obligations and delayed post. No reply came. Then the letter arrived. It bore the Camberhall seal. She opened it with hands that had already begun to understand, at some level below conscious thought, that something had gone irreparably wrong. It was brief. Miss Ambrose, His Grace the Duke of Camberhall asks that you understand the nature of his position and the obligations therein. What passed between you was the indulgence of youth and proximity. He trusts you will conduct yourself with the discretion appropriate to your station. Further correspondence is neither expected nor welcome. No signature beyond the seal. No hand she recognized. She read it 3 times. Not because she misunderstood it. Because some blows require more than one landing before the body accepts them. Then she folded it. Set it down on the table beside her. Sat very still in the way that people sit when the alternative is something they cannot afford in a room that is not entirely their own. She did not cry immediately. She thought about the yew hedge. The last evening. His voice saying I don't care what my father will simply. She thought about how certainty had looked on his face. Then she thought about how certainty, in her experience, had always belonged more readily to people who had never been required to pay for it. She cried then. Once. Fully. The kind that exhausts itself and leaves a person quieter than before. When it was done, she pressed her hands flat against the table, breathed, and began to think practically. She would need to think practically for some time. As it happened, for the next 7 years. Somewhere in Edinburgh, Harrison Camberhall was composing his 14th letter to her. He would finish it by morning. It would never arrive. His had already been intercepted. The reply he would receive instead was still being written. In his father's hand. I do not often linger on pain. It is not my place. But there are moments in a story where turning away would be its own kind of dishonesty. This is one of them. Harrison received the letter on a Wednesday. It arrived with the Morning Post, unremarkable among the diplomatic correspondence and estate reports his father's office continued to forward. He almost set it aside. Something, the handwriting, perhaps, or the particular weight of the paper, made him open it first. It was brief. Harrison, I have thought carefully and honestly about what passed between us. I think we were both caught in something that the distance has made clearer. You have a life I was never meant to enter, and I have been foolish to imagine otherwise. Please do not write again. I would like to remember what we had without it becoming something diminished by continuation. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk with the careful precision of someone managing something fragile, and looked out the window at Edinburgh's grey and indifferent skyline, and said nothing for a very long time. I should tell you what was actually happening at the estate that same Wednesday. Ada was in the east corridor when the housekeeper called her name. She was handed a letter. Camberhall seal. His handwriting, or what appeared to be it, close enough that only someone who had read 14 of his letters would notice the slight difference in the pressure of certain letters. The H in have. The way he closed his DS. She noticed. She read it anyway, because noticing and accepting are different actions, and sometimes the body requires the full text before it will believe what the hand already knows. Ada, I write this with more difficulty than you perhaps expect, and less than you deserve. My father has made the shape of my future clear to me in terms I cannot in good conscience ignore. What I feel, what I felt, was real. I do not ask you to doubt that. But real and possible are not the same country, and I find I cannot ask you to wait for a man who cannot, in the end, offer what waiting requires. You deserve better than a promise I am no longer certain I can keep. Forget me, if you can. I think you will manage it more gracefully than I will." She folded it, set it down, picked it up again and reread the line about real and possible. He would never have written that. The Harrison she knew had spent months insisting on the exact opposite. She knew the difference between his doubt and his certainty. She had watched him carefully enough. But she also knew that Edinburgh was a long way away. That fathers had long arms. That certainty, tested by enough pressure, could be shaped into something that resembled its opposite. Perhaps she had simply been wrong about him. The possibility sat in her chest like something she couldn't dislodge. 3 weeks later, she understood why thinking practically had become suddenly, urgently necessary. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she allowed it to become real. Then she allowed it to become real, and thought about her options with the systematic calm of someone who has very few of them. She told no one. Her parents were informed by someone else entirely. She suspected the housekeeper, who suspected the laundry schedule. The conversation that followed was not long. Her father's face cycled through several expressions before settling on fear, which then arranged itself into anger because anger was more familiar. "You will say nothing," he said. "To anyone. About any of it." She looked at him. "And where exactly would you have me go?" He didn't answer. Someone had already answered it for him. She understood this later, the arrangement, the settlement, the quiet coordination that had clearly been in motion before her parents even knew to panic. The convent outside Shropshire. Comfortable enough. Private enough. A carriage was arranged for the following Thursday. She packed the wooden box last. The letters inside it, his real ones, the ones that had arrived before the silence, she did not remove. She did not read them again. She simply carried them with her, because leaving them felt like agreeing to something she wasn't ready to agree to. Harrison, in Edinburgh, had by this point stopped eating regularly. He would not have described it as grief. He would have described it as adjustment. He was wrong. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not ask to be witnessed. It simply continues. Ada Ambrose was 20 years old when she arrived at the convent outside Shropshire. She was carrying 2 things she had not planned for: the letters and the children. The convent was quiet in the way that places are quiet when silence has been deliberately cultivated over centuries. Stone walls. Ordered days. The particular piece of a life structured around something larger than its individual inhabitants. Ada found, to her mild surprise, that she did not hate it. She had expected to. Had expected the walls to feel like punishment, the routine like restraint. Instead she discovered that structure, when you are trying to hold yourself together, can function as a kind of scaffolding. Something to move along when forward motion is all you have. She arrived in November. By December she had learned the rhythms of the place. By January she had made herself useful enough that the sisters stopped watching her with the particular careful attention reserved for those who might require intervention. She did not require intervention. She required, as it happened, a midwife. In late April. The birth was long. I will not dwell on it. Ada would not want me to. What I will tell you is that when it was over, and the sister placed not 1 but 2 small, furious people into her arms, Ada looked at them for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, "Oh." Not distress. Not despair. Something closer to recognition. She named the boy Harry. Not after his father, or not entirely. Harry was also her grandfather's name, a man who had worked his own land and asked nothing of anyone and died with his dignity intact. She gave the name both inheritances and let it settle. The girl she named Allie. Simple. Unhurried. A name that didn't reach for anything. She held them both and thought, practically, about what came next. This was, I had come to understand, how Ada processed everything that mattered. She felt it fully and then she organized it. What came next was this. She would raise them. She would raise them well. She would not spend the years ahead manufacturing bitterness to hand to children who had done nothing to deserve it. Harry arrived first and left the womb apparently already annoyed about something, which proved consistent with his character. He was loud, observant, and developed opinions about everything at an age when most children were still negotiating with gravity. Ali was quieter, watchful in the way that younger siblings sometimes are, calibrating the world through the filter of whoever arrived before them. She asked questions with the directness of someone who had decided early that approximations were a waste of everyone's time. Ada watched them become themselves with the specific attention of a woman who understood that she was, in many ways, their only context. She taught them what she knew. Reading, first, earlier than was perhaps typical. Then thinking carefully. Then the difference between what people say and what they mean, which she considered the most practical education she could offer. She did not speak of their father. When Harry asked, at 4 years old, with the blunt efficiency that characterized most of his inquiries, "Where is our father?" she told him that their father was a good man who did not know they existed. Harry considered this. Will he find out? "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. She kept the wooden box beneath her bed. She did not open it often. But she did not remove it either, and on the nights when the cultivated silence of the convent pressed too closely, she sometimes rested her hand on its lid without lifting it. That was enough. That was, for 7 years, exactly enough. The estate, 2 counties away, continued its business. The Duke mourned in the manner of composed men, which is to say, thoroughly and invisibly. He did not replace her. He simply became someone for whom replacement was no longer a relevant concept. And somewhere outside Shropshire, 2 children grew. One with his eyes. One with her questions. Both entirely unaware of what was coming. 7 years is long enough to become someone else. Harrison Camberhall had not become someone else. He had simply become a more controlled version of the person the grief had made him. There is a difference. Not everyone would notice it. I did. He arrived on a Thursday, which was unremarkable. The estate received him the way it received everything, with the permanent, unhurried dignity of a place that had outlasted several generations of Camberhalls and expected to outlast several more. The staff assembled. The housekeeper curtsied. The steward produced a summary of the estate's affairs over the preceding months with the efficiency of someone who had learned that the current duke appreciated brevity. Harrison moved through the welcome with the composed fluency of a man who had learned, somewhere in 7 years of diplomatic postings and careful living, to be present without being available. He was 31 years old. He looked it in the way that men do when the years have been substantive rather than merely passing, something behind the eyes that had not been there at 21, a quietness that was not the same as the quietness of youth. Then, he had been quiet because he was watching the world with interest. Now he was quiet because he had learned what watching cost. His engagement had been announced 6 months prior. Lady Cecily Northmore, second daughter of the Earl of Fairbridge. Intelligent, composed, politically suitable in every way that the word suitable had been designed to accommodate. She was not unkind. She was not pretending to feel more than she did, which Harrison respected. They had reached, through a series of careful conversations, a mutual understanding of what their arrangement was and was not. It was not love. Neither of them had said this aloud. Neither of them had needed to. His father had received the engagement with visible satisfaction, which Harrison had noted and filed alongside everything else he had learned to observe about his father without reacting to. Edward Camberhall was 63 now and moved more slowly, but his eyes had lost nothing of their cataloguing precision. "You've done well," his father said, at their first dinner. "I've done adequately," Harrison replied. His father smiled, the small, contained expression that served him in place of warmth. That is what well looks like, in the long run. Harrison did not respond to this. His rooms were as he had left them. This was either a coincidence or a statement, and with his father nothing was a coincidence. He moved through them without unpacking immediately, which was habit. 7 years of temporary residences had made him efficient about what he committed to. He found the letter in the 3rd drawer of the writing desk. Her last real one. the one that had arrived in October, before the silence. He had carried it through Edinburgh, through Brussels, through 2 years in the north, through the slow quiet rebuilding of a life from which something central had been removed, and then he had run out of places to carry it and had left it here, in this drawer, because leaving it felt like setting down a weight he'd carried long enough to forget was heavy. He did not read it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the drawer. He walked the estate that first evening. Alone, which was his preference, and which the staff had learned to accommodate without commentary. The grounds were in good order. The east garden had been replanted along different lines than he remembered, his father's doing, probably, some aesthetic decision made in his absence. The yew hedge stood exactly as it always had. He did not walk to it. He walked instead toward the western boundary, where the estate lands flattened toward the tenant farms, and stood for a while looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man performing the simple act of being somewhere and finding it more complicated than expected. He had told himself, during the years abroad, that returning would be neutral. It was not neutral. It was the specific, muted ache of a place that remembers you before you have decided how you feel about being remembered. He turned back toward the house before the light failed entirely. Tomorrow, he thought, he would begin the business of being home. He kept her letter in the drawer. He did not read it. He also did not throw it away. In 7 years, he never had. I think he always knew, below the level of conscious acknowledgement, that throwing it away would require a certainty he had never quite managed. He was right to hold on to it, though he did not yet know why. I have observed many moments of recognition in my time, the kind that rearrange a person from the inside. They do not look dramatic from the outside. They look like a man going very still. That is what I witnessed on the second morning of Harrison Camberhall's return. He had not intended to walk the eastern boundary again. He had intended, in fact, a productive morning, correspondence with the steward, a review of the tenancy agreements his father had restructured in his absence, the careful and unremarkable business of a duke resuming ownership of his own affairs. He was halfway through the tenancy documents when something pulled him toward the window. He could not have named it. He would not have tried. He had spent enough years in diplomatic rooms to understand that some instincts do not improve with interrogation. He set the documents down and went outside. The boy was at the edge of the tenant path, arguing with the under-steward. Not in the manner of a child throwing a fit, there was nothing uncontrolled about it. He was standing with his arms crossed and his chin slightly raised, making a point with the patient intensity of someone who had made it several times already and found the repetition irritating rather than discouraging. He looked to be about 6, perhaps 7. The under-steward, a man of 40 with considerable experience managing difficult situations, appeared to be losing. Harrison stopped walking. He told himself it was the audacity of it, a child of that age, on estate grounds, conducting himself like someone who believed his argument had merit and was prepared to wait until the other party recognized this. That was not why he stopped. He stopped because of the boy's face. It was not a vague resemblance. It was not the kind of similarity that requires goodwill and imagination to sustain. It was the specific, precise arrangement of features that a man recognizes in a mirror, the set of the jaw, the particular angle of attention, the dark eyes that were currently fixed on the under-steward with an expression Harrison had seen on his own face in every portrait his father had ever commissioned. The world did something strange and tectonic beneath his feet. He stayed where he was. The girl appeared from behind the hedgerow a moment later. Smaller, quieter. She assessed the argument in progress with a single sweep of her gaze, then looked past it, past the under-steward, past her brother, and found Harrison standing on the path. She looked at him directly, not in fear, not in deference, with the calm, unhurried evaluation of someone taking a careful measure of an unexpected thing. He recognized that too. God help him, he recognized that too. The under-steward noticed Harrison then and straightened immediately, relieved at the intervention. "Your Grace, I apologize," the children wandered from the. "What is the argument?" Harrison said. The under-steward blinked. "Your Grace. He's been making a point." Harrison looked at the boy. "What is it?" The boy uncrossed his arms. Recalibrated, the way intelligent people do when the audience changes. Then, with admirable economy, "The south fence on the Mallory plot is down. 3 posts. The steward said it would be addressed next month. Our chickens have already gone through twice." A pause. "Next month is not a solution. It is a postponement." Harrison looked at the understeward. The understeward looked at the ground. "See to the fence," Harrison said. "This week?" "Yes, Your Grace." The boy nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who had always believed the argument would land if it reached the correct authority. Then he turned to collect his sister, who had not moved from her position and was still watching Harrison with that steady, unreadable attention. "What is your name?" Harrison asked. Carefully. The word came out measured, as though he were afraid of what the answer would do to him. The boy looked back. "Harry." The girl said nothing, only looked. Harrison stood on the path and felt something fracture, quietly and completely, in the center of his chest. He did not move until they had gone. He returned to the house and sat at his desk for a long time without touching the tenancy documents. Then he rang for the steward. Not for estate business. He asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned to want information without revealing why he wants it. "The family on the eastern tenant path. Tell me about them." The steward hesitated. That hesitation told Harrison almost everything. "I have waited 9 chapters for this moment. So, I suspect, have you? I will ask you to temper your expectations only slightly. This is not the reunion of people who have been merely separated. This is the reunion of people who were deliberately unmade from each other. It does not look like relief. Not yet." The steward gave him an address. He gave it reluctantly, with the particular discomfort of a man who understood he was standing at the edge of something significant and had not been given instructions about what to do there. Harrison thanked him, dismissed him, and sat with the address for the remainder of the afternoon. He did not go that day. This was not cowardice. It was the recognition that arriving without composure would serve neither of them, and composure, at that particular moment, required time he was willing to take. He went the following morning. Alone. On foot. The cottage sat at the far edge of the estate lands, close enough to the boundary to suggest deliberate positioning, far enough from the main house to confirm it. Small, well kept, the garden organized with the same practical precision he remembered in everything she did. He stood at the gate for a moment. Then he opened it. She was in the garden. Her back was to him, and she did not hear his approach immediately. She was cutting something from the far bed, focused, unhurried. She was wearing a grey dress and her hair was up, and she was 27 years old, and she was very much alive. He stopped walking. She turned. The moment she saw him, she went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, though shock was present. The stillness of a person who has, in a single second, recalculated everything they believed about the shape of their life. He watched her do it. He watched the color leave her face and return. He watched her straighten, slowly, and set down what she was holding. Neither of them spoke. The garden held its breath. "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was even. He recognized the effort that required. "They told me you were dead." His own voice came out quieter than he intended. "They told me you died of fever." Something moved across her face. Brief. Contained. "They told me you chose your title." The words landed between them with the weight of 7 years. He took one step forward. She did not step back, but her hand found the garden gate behind her, not retreating, he thought. Steadying. "Ada." "Don't." Quiet. Not unkind. "Don't say my name like that yet. You haven't," she stopped. "Reorganized. You haven't earned that yet." He accepted this without argument. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 4 years. After the convent. The convent. 2 words that rearranged his understanding of the last 7 years into something he was not yet able to fully look at. "The twins," he said. Her chin lifted. Fractionally. The specific movement of someone preparing for a conversation they have rehearsed in their worst moments and hoped never to have. "You saw them?" "Yesterday. On the tenant path." He paused. "Harry argued a fence repair out of my understeward." Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Almost. Not quite. "He argues everything out of everyone eventually," she said. "He has your persistence." The words were out before she could reconsider them. He watched her reconsider them anyway, watched the brief flicker of something that might have been grief or anger or both, moving through her composure like weather through glass. "I didn't know," Harrison said. "Ada, I need you to understand. I know you didn't know. Even. Certain. I worked that out. Eventually." A pause. "It took me longer than it should have." "How long?" She looked at him directly, the way she always had, the way that had made him stop in the corridor 11 years ago. "3 years," she said. "I spent 3 years believing you had simply chosen correctly." The quiet that followed was not comfortable. It was, however, honest. "Why now?" she asked. He understood the question entirely. Not "how did you find me" or "what do you want?" Why now? Why, after 7 years, does your arrival require me to rebuild the equilibrium I have spent considerable effort constructing? "I saw his face," Harrison said simply. She nodded. Once. As though this were the only answer she would have accepted. "You're engaged," she said. "Yes." "To someone appropriate." "Yes." She absorbed this. "Then I'll ask again. Why now?" He didn't have an answer that was adequate. He suspected she knew this. He suspected she was asking anyway because the question deserved to exist in the air between them regardless of whether it could be satisfactorily resolved. "Because I would rather know the truth and not know what to do with it," he said finally, "than continue not knowing and call that living." She looked at him for a long moment. Then her composure, that extraordinary architecture of a thing she had built and maintained across 7 years and a forged letter and 2 children and a convent outside Shropshire, developed, very quietly, a single crack. One tear. Only one. She did not chase it. She stood in her garden and let it fall, and then she was composed again, but differently, the way something is composed after it has been briefly, honestly broken. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "The children will be at lessons. We can talk properly." He nodded. Turned to go. "Harrison." He stopped. "I kept your letters," she said. "The real ones." He stood with his back to her for a moment, absorbing this. Then he walked back through the gate without turning around, because turning around would have required a composure he no longer had. She watched him go. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and pressed both hands flat against the wood. The same gesture she had made 7 years ago. Some habits form in grief and outlast their cause. Tomorrow, she had said. She was already dreading it. She was already waiting for it. Both things, simultaneously. That, I have found, is what hope looks like when it has been taught to be careful. Truth, when it has been buried carefully, does not surface cleanly. It comes up in pieces. Some sharp. Some so quiet you almost miss what they are. Harrison Camberhall spent 4 days digging. What he found did not surprise him. That was, perhaps, the most damning thing of all. He returned to the cottage the following morning as agreed. They sat across from each other at her kitchen table, the same table she had pressed her hands against the night before, though neither of them knew this about the other, and they talked for 2 hours with the careful, methodical honesty of people who have decided that approximations are no longer affordable. She told him about the letter, the Camberhall seal, the handwriting that was almost his. He told her about the letter he had received, the fever, the burial, the specific airless way grief had settled into him and never entirely lifted. She listened without interrupting. He listened without defending. By the end of the first hour, the shape of what had been done to them was visible in the space between their teacups, ugly and precise. "Your father," she said. "Not a question." "I don't know yet," he said. "I intend to." She nodded. "Be certain before you confront him. He will have prepared for uncertainty." He looked at her. "You've thought about this?" "I've had 7 years," she said simply. "I've thought about most things." He began carefully. Not with accusation. Accusation, deployed prematurely, produces defense rather than disclosure. He had learned this in diplomatic rooms across 2 continents, and he applied it now with the cold efficiency of someone who has decided that the skills his father sent him abroad to acquire would be used, with some irony, against him. He reviewed correspondence archives in the estate office, requesting records under the guise of administrative review. He spoke with the housekeeper, retired now, living in the village, under the pretense of reconnecting with long-standing staff. She remembered Ada. Of course she did. She remembered the arrangement. The carriage. The Thursday in November. She remembered who had given the instruction. She did not say the name. She did not need to. The letter archives were more explicit. His father's correspondence was meticulous. Edward Camberhall had always believed that a well-documented record protected against misinterpretation, which was true, and had apparently never considered that the same documentation might one day be reviewed by someone with cause to look carefully. Harrison found the draft. Not the letter itself, that had been sent and received and had done its work, but the draft, in his father's hand, on estate stationery, with 2 lines crossed out and rewritten where the tone had been miscalibrated on the first attempt. "What passed between you was the indulgence of youth and proximity." He recognized the phrase immediately. He sat with the draft in his hands for a long time. He found the payment records 3 days later. Modest sums, distributed across 2 entries in the household accounts under maintenance expenditures, the kind of figures small enough to avoid scrutiny, large enough to communicate that silence had a price and the price had been met. Her parents' names were not listed. They didn't need to be. The timing corresponded precisely. He also found a letter from the convent. Acknowledgement of arrangement. Clinical. Courteous. His father had known about the pregnancy. He had known, and he had managed it, and he had said nothing. Harrison set the letter down on the desk with the same careful precision he had used 7 years ago in Edinburgh, when a different letter had required the same management of his hands. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling and breathed with the deliberate regularity of a man preventing something from becoming something else. He allowed himself exactly 5 minutes. Then he went to find his father. I should note, for the record. He told Ada what he found before he confronted his father. He went to the cottage first. Showed her the draft. She read it without expression. Set it down. Said, "The crossed-out lines are worse than what he sent." He agreed. She asked if he was prepared for the confrontation. He said he thought so. She said, "He will not apologize. Prepare for that specifically." He said, "I know." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "So do I," she said. And somehow that, her quiet, unsurprised certainty, made him steadier than anything else could have. I have observed Edward Camberhall for 30 years. I have watched him negotiate titles, dissolve inconvenient alliances, and manage scandal with the precision of a man who considers chaos a personal affront. I had wondered, sometimes, what it would take to find the edge of his composure. His son, it turned out. His son, with a folded draft letter and 7 years of evidence. That was enough. Harrison did not request a meeting. He simply appeared in his father's study at 4:30, the hour his father reserved for private correspondence, when the household had learned not to interrupt, and closed the door behind him. Edward looked up from his desk. He registered his son's expression with the rapid, practiced assessment of a man who had spent decades reading rooms. Then he set down his pen with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who refuses to concede the first movement to anyone. Harrison. Father. Harrison crossed to the chair across the desk and Saturday. He did not place the draft letter on the table immediately. He held it in his hand, at his side, and looked at his father with the specific patience of a man who has decided to let silence do the first work. It was Edward Camberhall's son doing precisely what Edward Camberhall had taught him. The father recognized this. Something moved behind his eyes. "You've been reviewing the correspondence archives," Edward said. "I have." "Administrative review," the steward told me. "That is what I told the steward, yes." A pause. His father looked at him with the evaluating stillness of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation they believed they had managed. "You found something," Edward said. Harrison placed the draft on the desk. His father looked at it for a long moment without touching it. He did not need to read it. The recognition in his expression was immediate and controlled and told Harrison everything remaining that he had not already known. "I preserved the duchy," his father said. Quiet. Measured. The tone of a man presenting a position he has long considered settled. "You forged letters," Harrison said. "I managed a situation that you were too young and too—" "You forged letters," Harrison said again. Not louder. Precisely the same volume and register. Simply immovable. His father stopped. The fire in the grate had burned low. Neither of them moved to address it. "She was a housemaid," Edward said finally. "Whatever she was beyond that, however composed, however intelligent, the world does not reorganize itself around personal preference. You would have destroyed your position, your inheritance, 3 generations of. You knew about the children." The room went very quiet. His father's expression did not change. That, Harrison understood, was its own kind of answer, the composure of a man who had prepared for this moment because he had always known it was possible. "I knew," Edward said. "You knew she was alive. You knew she was carrying my children. You arranged the convent, the payment, the silence, and you allowed me to mourn her for 7 years. I allowed you to move forward. You stole my children." Harrison's voice remained level. This was the most frightening version of his anger, the one that had learned, from its father, not to raise itself. "You looked at 2 people and decided their lives were yours to arrange. You decided I would be better served by grief than by truth." "Yes," his father said. "I did." No qualification. No apology. The answer of a man who has examined his choices and found them, on balance, correct. Harrison looked at him across the desk. "I'm going to marry her," he said. "You are engaged. I am going to end that engagement. And I am going to marry Ada Ambrose. And I am going to bring her and my children to this estate, where they should have been 7 years ago." His father's hands folded on the desk. "If you do this, I will disinherit you. The title passes to your cousin. Everything, the estate, the income, the position. Then it passes to my cousin." Silence. It was not the answer his father had expected. Harrison could see this, the fractional recalibration, the reassessment of a man discovering that the leverage he has held for 30 years has been quietly, completely relocated. "You would give up everything," Edward said. "You gave it up for me 7 years ago," Harrison said. "You simply didn't tell me." He stood. He did not take the draft letter from the desk. He left it there, between them, because it belonged to his father. It was his father's work, his father's document, his father's legacy to manage. He moved toward the door. "Harrison." He stopped. Did not turn. "She will never be received," his father said. "Society will not." "I know," Harrison said. He opened the door. "I find I no longer require society's reception," he said. "Only hers." He left. Edward Camberhall sat alone in his study for a long time after. I watched him. He looked at the draft letter on his desk. He looked at the low fire. He looked at the door his son had walked through. He did not call him back. But he did not reach for the disinheritance documents either. Not that evening. A man who has spent 30 years being strategically certain. had just encountered something his strategy had not accounted for. A son who had learned his lessons too well and applied them elsewhere. Scandal, in polite society, moves in a particular way. Not like fire, sudden, consuming, obvious. More like water finding cracks. Quiet. Inevitable. Deeply interested in the lowest point. Harrison Camberhall was about to give it somewhere to go. He did not appear concerned. That, of course, made it worse. He called on Lady Cecily Northmour 3 days after the confrontation. Not immediately. 3 days was deliberate. Long enough to be certain. Short enough that uncertainty could not be mistaken for hesitation. He requested a private audience, which her mother granted with the faintly suspicious graciousness of a woman who had learned to read the temperature of a room before entering it. Lady Cecily received him in the morning sitting-room, which was pale blue and very quiet, and she was already composed in the way that suggested she had been composing herself since his request arrived. She was perceptive. He had always appreciated this about her. "You are going to end this," she said, before he had fully sat down. "Yes," he said. "I am. And I owe you a complete explanation." "You owe me honesty," she said. "The explanation can be as complete as it needs to be." He told her. Not everything, some of it was not his to distribute. But enough. The maid. The years. The forged letters. The children who had his face and her directness and had been raised 2 counties away without his knowledge. Lady Cecily listened with the careful attention of someone filing information for future use. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" she asked. 10 days. She nodded slowly. "And you're certain?" "I am." She looked at him with the evaluating directness that had always made her good company, even when they both understood the limitations of what they were to each other. "I will not pretend this is entirely welcome news," she said. "But I will also not pretend I expected something different." A pause. "You have never looked at me the way a man should look at a woman he intends to spend his life beside. I noticed. I thought it was simply your manner." "I thought so too," he said quietly. Something almost like warmth passed between them, the particular warmth of 2 people releasing each other from something neither had been entirely suited to carry. "The scandal will be considerable," she said. "Yes. My father will be. I know. I will speak with him. Whatever I can manage by way of—" "Don't." She said it firmly but without heat. "Don't manage it. Just end it cleanly and let the pieces fall where they fall. Managing it will only extend it." He looked at her with something that was genuine and uncomplicated. "You would have been a formidable duchess." "I will be a formidable something else," she said. "I expect I'll recover." The announcement was handled through the appropriate channels. His father's solicitor received notice the same afternoon. The Earl of Fairbridge received a personal letter from Harrison, formal, unambiguous, accepting full responsibility without elaboration. Lady Cecily's reputation was protected in every way available to him, which she had not asked for and which he provided regardless. The Ton received the news within a week. He had not underestimated the whispers. They moved through drawing rooms and morning calls with the brisk efficiency of information that arrives gift-wrapped in exactly the right amount of impropriety. A broken engagement. The Duke of Camberhall. No explanation offered publicly. No name attached to the cause. Yet, the whispers added. With great anticipation. His father said nothing when the announcement reached him. Harrison had expected something, a summons, a letter, a final deployment of consequence. Instead there was silence from the direction of the East Wing, where Edward had taken to spending his evenings since their confrontation. A silence that was different from his usual silence. Less strategic. More like a man sitting with a situation he had not finished calculating. Harrison let him sit. He had his own calculations to attend to. He went to Ada that evening. She had heard. The estate staff moved information with the same efficiency as the Ton, simply with less ornamentation. She was in the garden when he arrived, which he was beginning to understand was where she went when she needed to think with her hands. She looked up when he opened the gate. "You ended it," she said. "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "How is she?" The question arrested him briefly. That Ada's first inquiry was for Lady Cecily's condition rather than her own situation was, he did not have an immediate word for what it was. "Composed," he said. "Considerably more gracious than the situation required." Ada nodded, returned her attention to the garden bed. "That's something, at least." He stood at the gate and watched her work and thought about how entirely himself he felt, standing there, in a way he had not felt in 7 years. "Ada." "I know," she said, without looking up. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you haven't said." She sat back on her heels, looked at him. "I'm not ready to hear it yet, Harrison. Not today." He accepted this. "Tomorrow?" he asked. The corner of her mouth moved. "Almost." "Perhaps," she said. "Come back tomorrow and we'll see." He walked back to the estate in the dark. The scandal was already moving through its appointed channels. His father was sitting with his calculations. Lady Cecily was, presumably, being formidable. And Ada Ambrose was still in her garden. Working. Thinking. Almost ready. I have found, in all my years of observation, that almost is where the most important things live. Just before they become certain. There are conversations that change the direction of a life. Most people recognize them only afterward. Ada Ambrose, I suspect, recognized this one before it began. She had always been perceptive that way. She simply needed to decide what to do with what she perceived. He came back the following morning. She had known he would. She had known it the way she knew most things about him, not because he was predictable, but because she had spent 11 years, -7 of enforced forgetting, learning the particular grammar of how he moved through the world. The children were at lessons. The cottage was quiet. She made tea because it gave her hand something to do, and because the ritual of it, the specific, ordinary sequence of kettle and cup and measured patience, had become, over 7 years, her preferred method of approaching difficult things. She set a cup in front of him and sat across the table. He did not touch it immediately. Neither did she. "I cannot return the years," he said. "No. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot," he stopped. "Reorganized. There is no version of this where I arrive without damage already done. I understand that. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise." She looked at him across the table. "Then what are you asking?" "I am asking you to let me refuse to lose more." He held her gaze. "I am asking for whatever is left. However much that is. However long it takes to rebuild what was taken." A pause. "I am not asking you to forgive 7 years over a cup of tea. I am asking if there is a door still open. Even slightly." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was conducting its morning business with considerable enthusiasm, entirely indifferent to the weight of what was happening inside. "I need to tell you something," Ada said. "Tell me." "I was angry for a long time. Even. Direct. Not at you. I worked out relatively quickly that you hadn't chosen to leave. At the situation. At your father. At my parents, who were frightened and chose compliance over their daughter." A pause. "At myself, sometimes. For believing it possible in the first place." "Ada." "I'm not finished. Not unkind. Simply clear. I was angry, and then I was practical, because the children needed practical far more than they needed my anger. And somewhere in the process of being practical, she stopped. Looked at her cup. "I built something. It is small. It is nothing like what you have. But it is mine, and it is stable, and I need you to understand that walking back into it is not a simple thing. It has weight. It has people in it who have only ever known this version of their life." "I know," he said. Harry will have questions. Ali will have more, phrased better. The corner of her mouth moved. They deserve honest answers. I will answer every one, he said. As many times as they need asking. She looked at him then, fully, in the way she had always looked at him, the way that had made him stop in a corridor 11 years ago and find, to his considerable surprise, that he did not want to look away. You understand what this costs you, she said. The position. Society. Your father's. Yes. I need you to say it plainly. Not because I doubt you. Because I have spent 7 years building a life on what I thought was plain and it wasn't, and I will not do that again. He understood. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, and looked at her with the unguarded directness of a man who has finished performing composure for the evening. I understand that marrying you may cost me my inheritance. I understand that society will whisper, and some doors will close, and my father may never offer his blessing. I understand that you will not be received in certain rooms and that I will be diminished in certain estimations. A pause. I understand all of it, Ada. I chose it. I would choose it again before I finished the sentence. The quiet that followed was different from the ones before. It had something in it. She picked up her tea, drank, set it down. The children will need to meet you properly, she said. Not as the Duke. As their father. Those are different introductions and they cannot happen on the same day. I understand. Harry will test you. Persistently and without apology. I would expect nothing less. Ali will watch you for a long time before she decides anything. Do not attempt to accelerate that. I won't. She nodded slowly. The particular nod of someone who has made a decision and is in the process of making peace with having made it. I have not stopped, she paused. The most careful pause I had observed from her. I tried. For the first 3 years, I tried considerably. She met his eyes. It didn't take. He said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would have improved upon it. She stood. Moved to the window. Looked out at the garden with the expression of a woman taking a last quiet look at a life she was about to expand in ways she couldn't entirely predict. I will need time, she said. I have time, he said. I have the rest of it, if you'll have me. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, she was not crying. She was composed, and clear-eyed, and 27 years old, and standing in her own kitchen making a decision entirely on her own terms. Come back Thursday, she said. Meet them properly. We'll begin there. He stood. Thursday. He moved toward the door, and then stopped, because there was one more thing and it had waited long enough. Ada. She looked at him. I kept your letters too, he said. Every one. The drawer in my study. I never, he stopped. I never threw them away. She absorbed this. Pressed her lips together briefly. Go home, Harrison, she said softly. Not a dismissal. Something closer to its opposite. He went. She stood at the window and watched him cross the garden. Then she went to the bedroom. Pulled the wooden box from beneath the bed. Opened it, for the first time in 7 years, and looked at his letters inside. She did not read them. Not yet. She simply looked. Then she closed the box. And left it on top of the bed. Not beneath it. That was enough for one day. That was, I thought, everything. I have been a discreet observer of this particular story for 14 chapters. I did not expect to be moved by the ending. I have seen too many endings to be surprised by them. And yet, here we are. The wedding was small. This was not a concession. It was a preference, Ada's, stated plainly, when Harrison had offered whatever she wished. She had looked at him across the kitchen table and said, I do not need witnesses. I need it to be real. It was real. A parish church 12 miles from the estate. The vicar, 2 witnesses from the village, and the twins, Harry in a coat that he had grown into approximately 1 week prior and was deeply satisfied about, Ali in pale blue with her mother's eyes and her father's stillness, holding Ada's hand with the calm propriety of someone who had decided to take the occasion seriously. They had met him properly on the Thursday, as arranged. Harry had asked 11 questions in the first hour, several of which required Harrison to be honest in ways that were not comfortable, all of which he answered without deflection. By the second hour, Harry had begun showing him things, the fence he'd argued repaired, the particular corner of the garden where something interesting happened to the light in the afternoon, with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone deciding, provisionally, to share what he valued. Ali had watched all of this from a careful distance. On the third visit, she had sat beside Harrison at the kitchen table while he and Ada talked, and said nothing for 40 minutes, and then looked up and asked, "Did you miss her?" The table went quiet. "Every day," Harrison said. Ali had nodded once, with the gravity of someone filing a satisfactory answer, and returned to her book. She had called him father 2 weeks later, unprompted, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely. Harrison had not remarked upon it. He understood, from Ada, that remarking upon Ali's decisions accelerated nothing and occasionally reversed them. He was learning. Edward Camberhall did not attend the wedding. He had been informed. A letter, from Harrison, brief, factual, extending the courtesy of notice without the pretense of requesting permission. His father had not responded. The disinheritance papers had not arrived. Harrison did not know whether this was strategy or something else. He did not, at present, require the answer. He had made his choice with full awareness of the cost, and the cost, as yet, had not fully presented itself. He suspected it would. He found, to his mild surprise, that he could wait. Ada came to the estate on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with procession or announcement. The carriage arrived at the servants' entrance out of habit, her habit, 7 years of understanding which doors were hers, and Harrison had been waiting there specifically, and offered her his hand at the step, and said nothing, and she had taken it. She had stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the ceilings, those particular ceilings, the ones that had spent decades reminding people of their place, and Harrison had watched her look at them. "Well," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. She straightened. Moved forward. The estate received her the way it received everything, with the permanent, unhurried dignity of a place that had outlasted several generations of Camberhalls. It would outlast this too. Only now, she was part of what it would outlast. Edward appeared at dinner that first week. Unannounced. He simply arrived at the dining room at the appointed hour and sat in his usual chair and accepted the soup with the composure of a man who had decided, for reasons he had not shared with anyone, to be present. Ada looked at him across the table. He looked at his soup. Harrison looked at neither of them and buttered his bread with the focused attention of a man pretending to be very interested in bread. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Ali, who had been watching the entire tableau with the forensic interest she brought to most human behavior, looked at Edward and said, "You have the same hands as Harry." Edward looked up. Harry, across the table, examined his own hands with sudden interest. Something moved across Edward Camberhall's face. Brief. Unguarded. Gone before it could be named with certainty, but present long enough that Harrison saw it, and Ada saw it, and neither of them remarked upon it. "So I do," Edward said. He returned to his soup. But he came to dinner again the following evening. And the one after that. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No apology that arrived with the weight of full acknowledgement. No scene in which Edward Camberhall looked at his grandchildren and was visibly remade by the experience into something warmer and more honest than he had been. That was not who he was. What happened instead was slower. A thaw so incremental it could only be observed across weeks rather than moments. Harry arguing something across the dinner table and Edward listening with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite suppression of approval. Ali asking Edward a direct question one afternoon in the garden and Edward answering it with more care than the question strictly required. The grandchildren did not soften him. They simply made him curious. And curiosity, in a man like Edward Camberhall, was the beginning of most things. Ada watched all of this from a position of careful neutrality. She did not pursue warmth from him. She did not require it. She had not come to the estate to be acknowledged by a man whose acknowledgment had always carried conditions. She had come because it was her home now, and her children's home, and that was authorization enough. If Edward came around, she would accept it. If he didn't, she had survived considerably worse. It was a Sunday afternoon in late autumn when Harrison found her on the terrace. The grounds below were amber and still, the light doing the particular thing it did at that hour, at that season, that made the estate look like something from before ambition had arrived and complicated it. Harry was below, arguing something with the understeward, the same understeward, a man who had by this point accepted his fate with considerable grace. The fence had been repaired. Harry had found other things. Ali was sitting on the stone steps reading, her back straight, turning pages with the focused deliberateness of someone for whom reading was serious business. Ada had her hands around a cup of tea and was watching them with the expression of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not entirely dare to believe in and is in the process of believing in it anyway. Harrison stood beside her. He did not put his arm around her immediately. He stood with her first, in the way that people stand when the moment is large enough to require simply being present in it before adding anything. Then he did. She leaned into it, slightly. The specific weight of someone allowing themselves to be held without reservation, which was different from all the other ways she had held herself across all the other years. Below, Harry made his point. The understeward conceded. Ali turned a page. The estate was quiet in the way that places are quiet when everything in them is, for the moment, exactly where it belongs. He had not overthrown power. He had not dismantled his father's world or corrected 7 years in a single gesture or arrived home on a white horse with justice in his thalbag. He had simply refused to lose more. And then, one careful day at a time, he had stopped losing. That is where I will leave them. On the terrace. The light doing what autumn light does. The children below being entirely themselves. The estate around them, old and permanent and finally theirs. I told you at the beginning that this was not a love story the ton was meant to hear. I was right. It was too quiet for them. Too patient. Too unwilling to perform itself for an audience. The best ones usually are. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments, would you have chosen love over inheritance? And if you were her, would you have trusted him again after 7 years? I always read your thoughts, and I love seeing how differently we all feel about these choices. If you're new here and you enjoy stories where love must fight against power, betrayal, and time, consider subscribing. There are many more waiting for you. And before you go, tell me again where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. Wherever you are in the world, I'm grateful you spent your time here. Until our next story, Lord Whistledown.